So welcome, Mike Raine, author, podcaster, mountain leader. How are you this morning?
Very well, thank you, Mike. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me along.
Oh, thank you for giving us your time. It's great to have you along. Busy day for you at the moment in Snowdonia. Things starting to pick up again?
It's an apprehensive time. We are open in Wales at the moment, so it's been increased numbers. Don't quite know what Easter weekend's going to bring. The weather forecast is good at the moment, but bizarrely snow forecast on Monday. So what effect that's going to have, we're not sure. But of course, the big release is April the 12th now, where we're going to let people from England back in.
Yes. Oh no, the floodwaters have opened. Yeah.
You can imagine it's enormous mixed feelings over here. You know, there are lots of businesses that are desperate to get going again, get tourism and visitors working. It's absolutely essential. But obviously last year in the gaps between lockdowns, along with everywhere else, you know, Scotland, the lakes, every park in every city, we just saw some really disappointing behaviour from people. And it's hard to see how that's going to be any different this year.
Yeah, it's a very double-edged sword, isn't it, unfortunately? Yeah, okay. So, I believe you're a former teacher. Just very briefly, just tell the viewers and the listeners a little bit about yourself. What's your background in?
So what I actually do now, and easy to work backwards, what I do now is I run a very small business offering environmental training, further training, CPD type training, principally for mountain leaders, mountaineering instructors. We get international mountain leaders, mountain guys, all the lot come along. But that is typically focused around nature, based on the work on nature, Snowdonia, that sort of thing. But there's quite a range of stuff. That's all on my website. To get to this point, I worked for 15 years at Plas Brenin as a senior instructor. And before that, I was a geography teacher in schools. We can go further back, but it starts. So fundamentally, it's that career of teaching, then working in Plas Brenin, plus loads of other stuff, as you can imagine, volunteering, working in different centres, etc., etc. So that all has put me into this place now whereby I don't have to work as much, and I can kind of pick and choose what I want to do. And the stuff that I get really excited about is the environmental stuff. And that's just the knowledge and understanding of the places that we're walking and climbing in, really.
Yeah. Which is, as you say, with the issues we've had with poor behaviour and people flooding into the countryside and a lack of awareness, it's been a real problem, hasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, for those that aren't aware, Mike is he's very much into the environment, and he's the author of an exceedingly good book, which is this one here. Look at that. It's a fabulous book, beautifully written, Mike, I have to say. An absolutely wonderful little book, and it's kind of core reading for the mountain leader syllabus, really, isn't it? What's considered so, even if not officially so.
It seems very popular, and of course it works for any acidic uplands. You know, you're going to see pretty much the same stuff on most of the Scottish Hills or the Lake District Hills or Dartmoor or the Peak District. It's just that when you come to putting a title on a book, Nature of the Acidic Uplands it's not a great title, really. And there's a special place in Snowdonia called Cumidwell, which has had grazing sheep removed for something like 15, 20 years now. And what that means is that particular coombe, which is quite near to the road, just shows you pretty much everything you're going to see on a hill in the UK. You've got to work pretty hard to find something that's not in Cumidwell. And that's from common bog species to woodland species to Arctic alpines, some of which only grow in that area. So it's you know, the star of the show is Cumidwell, really, and it's a brilliant exemplar if you want to just know a little bit more about what's going on our hills.
And of course, Cumidwell is completely open to the public and walkers, isn't it? It's not closed off, so people can go up there and have a look. Of course, with the advice that don't pick anything or dig it up, please.
That's correct.
Just leave it where it is. So, I mean, you've answered a couple of my questions I had there, which was firstly, are the flora and fauna of Snowdonia completely unique? Obviously not. I guess there are some unique bits to Snowdonia.
Yeah. There's the odd thing. There's the Snowdon lily, which we're really proud of because that doesn't grow anywhere else in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
It is fairly common in parts of the Alps and America and Norway, but it's a leftover species from the last ice age, the advance of the ice, and it only got left in Snowdonia and isn't seen in any of the other British hills.
Right.
But there are some plants in in Cymydwell that grow in like 2 places in North Wales and maybe 1 place in the lakes and 2 or 3 places in Scotland. So some other quite accessible things like tufted saxifrage and alpine saxifrage or mountain avens that you're just not going to come into them in many places. So it goes back to the geology. I said acidic uplands earlier. What you've got interbedded in Cymydwell are some less acidic layers, which give a substrata that some of these more special plants find attractive and can grow in. So it's a unique set of circumstances, really. And then with having the sheep grazing removed, it creates a very special place.
Yeah. So for those who aren't geologically or geographically minded, I guess the soils basically are made up of partly of the stuff that breaks down from above, from the grasses and the material come from above, but also from the rocks weathering out underneath. So the chemical behavior of the rock kind of dictates what's above, which you can see very well in the Peak District, can't you? You've got the dark grit, and then you get a very stark change around Edale into the limestone, which is an entirely different rock, and you get an entirely different appearance to the landscape. So yeah, quite important. So I mean,
really obvious there.
Sorry, say again.
Go on.
So I mean, are there protected species in Wales that or Snowdonia that particularly need to be looked after? Obviously, if there are, the location is going to be kept fairly secret, I should imagine. But there are species there that are, you mentioned, rare. Are there things that are critically endangered?
Well, they all are to some degree.
I guess so, yeah.
The way things are changing with the climate, so people do monitor the extent of the Arctic alpine species, which obviously as the climate warms up, we don't expect to see Arctic alpines forever in England or Wales, really. So the people are monitoring that, but of course it's hard to separate climate from weather. And whilst we know the climate is warming up faster than it's ever warmed up in any period that we can identify through all our records, it's still relatively slow to us. We just see these odd weather patterns and try and work it out. So yeah, it's all pretty spectacular. And as you said yourself, Mike, there, so don't pick anything, because you might come across a little cluster of something that looks abundant in that particular location, but actually it only grows in that location and it's nowhere else. So picking stuff is not ideal at all.
Yeah. No, and I guess, I mean, the other, as well as sort of the weather and climate, is the man-made impact on the landscape, isn't it? All of our upland areas really are quite intensively altered by man's activities, farming and sheep farming in particular. I mean, Cymydwell, you say, has had sheep removed for quite a few years now. Is there an argument, you think, for making wider expanses of the uplands less agricultural and removing sheep?
I'm pretty sure there is. I have to be slightly careful, because as hill walkers, we quite like sheep. I mean, the Herdwick's a symbol of the Lake District, isn't it? And the Welsh mountain sheep, they're bonny little things, and everybody loves a lamb. When you do your mountain leader training and assessment, you spend a lot of time looking for random sheepfolds on the hill, and everything stops when you see the fantastic sheepdogs up there. I know people here who've been in sheep farming families for generations, 300-400 years of generation. So there's a real culture there. Certainly in Snowdonia, the community groups are often come from the sheep farming community. So the councils, the shows, if you need to borrow a trailer, if you need somebody to weed the war memorial, they usually come from that community. So it is the fabric of all our upland areas, and it's certainly rich here in Snowdonia because it's also the bedrock of the Welsh language as well. So, you know, when you say we want to see fewer sheep on the hills, yes, we do want to see fewer sheep on the hills, but nobody wants to see no sheep on the hills. But quite clearly, when you look at some of our uplands, with a little bit of thinking, you think, actually, there's not a lot going on up there. It has been dominated by species of grasses or by bracken, which are not productive for sheep and are not useful for biodiversity. So we definitely need to see some areas where sheep grazing is removed. Putting cattle on the land is a good thing because that they graze in a different way and they create little habitats themselves. So just tweaking what we're doing, and maybe, and some people doing this, having some areas where sheep are excluded and grazing is excluded, certainly for a period of years, you know, 5-10 years, and just see how it goes. Any land needs some management. This is another thing you'll hear, but the management that mimics wild is more like a management that's got cattle grazing than sheep grazing, which is due to ecological history, and we'll probably get a little bit too deep there. But yeah, I mean, to summarise there, when we go hill walking, we love the wide open spaces. They are not natural.
Yeah,
it is not exactly naturally like that. Of course, we've made it like that and we like it like that, but we need to just shift the balance so it's a bit more natural than it is now. I think is where I would say.
So you're a fan of a bit of rewilding, but not complete rewilding.
Yeah, I mean, you know, rewilding is wonderful, and there's some fantastic things going on in the rewilding sphere. But we can't rewild everywhere. It's just not going to happen. You know, we talk about food production, but also social systems make it impossible. But what we can do everywhere is nature-friendly farming. And what I would encourage viewers and listeners to do is to read, possibly the easiest one to read at the moment is James Rebank's book, English Pastoral, which is a really nice read. You know,
it's a lovely book, that.
Yeah, and he's telling the story of how farming's gone in his case in the Lake District, and I think it's really illuminating. And then follow him on Twitter, and you'll get a good picture of what can be done and work for productive farming as well as nature. Yeah,
he did a very good podcast interview, actually, which I'll put the link in the show notes, actually. He did a very good interview on a podcast. And again, for those who aren't familiar with the term rewilding, I mean, essentially at its purest, it's about removing all management of the land and just letting it get back to doing what it would have done by itself anyway, which, from what I've seen, generally leads to 10 years of fairly scrubby land before it starts to do anything really productive. But it produces some good results. So I wonder if there's an argument for reintroducing wolves back into Snowdonia to solve some of the problems we have with people who aren't so considerate of the environment. Might not be a bad thing. But
I don't think wolves naturally attack people. And obviously, the wolves are the problem with the rewilding story. I'm pretty sure there's space for wolves in Scotland, but you know, it's kind of a bit of a controversial thing, isn't it? Wolves and bears, but yeah.
Can you just
rewilding is about a bit more than that, really. But I think if you think in terms of nature-friendly farming rather than rewilding, we've got something that we can have a proper conversation around.
Yeah, I guess if you think about it, if you remove the sheep farming and the cattle farming from Wales, or more the sheep farming, really all you're left with these days is probably tourism, really, isn't it? It's apart from the shops that serve the local communities, there's not much there.
It's the problem you'll find in any, particularly the northern and western communities. So communities that relied on fishing, on farming, on slate quarrying, on slate mining. If you go down to Cornwall, it's the same with tin mining and all the rest of it. All these sort of edge communities have to reinvent themselves. And a lot of people there have an industrial legacy. So there's a want for proper jobs. And if you're building a factory, you're probably not going to build it in Cornwall or North Wales or the far northwest of Scotland. So the way to look at tourism for me is every pound a tourist spends in Snowdonia is a pound that wouldn't have been spent in Snowdonia. Mm. It's the same in Scotland, in Ireland, in Cornwall. Easiest is probably the wrong word, but it's the most accessible way of getting cash into the area. And if somebody come up with a good and other ideas, then fantastic. But obviously, while we subsidise agriculture, that's a difficult balance, isn't it? I'd love to see agriculture paying its way and the subsidy going into sport nature friendly. But the problem with that is it means you and I have got to spend more on our food and our Welsh lamb and stuff. And while the Kiwis are importing lamb cheap and the Welsh can produce it, it's a whole messy economic system, isn't it? But the constant shout I hear from local farmers is if you can buy local produce, you can buy it direct from the farm or at least a local butcher, then you will make a difference to what is going on.
Yeah. So I guess if you're going for a day's walking, the temptation is to go to your local Tesco's and stock up before you go. And, what we'd be saying is, well, wait until you get there and find the local shop and spend your money there and help the community.
That would make a massive difference rather than stocking up before you come. Even with fuel and with food, if you could buy it here, that makes a difference. It really does. It's amazing. It does make a difference.
Yeah. You mentioned before about the communities in Wales, and obviously sort of very tight-knit communities as there are in Scotland and other places. Has there been a significant change in the time you've been there? Because where are you based? Are you in Llanberis at the moment?
I'm in the Conwy Valley now.
Right.
We live just north of Betws in Nant Conwy. Which is a beautiful place because we're in the rain shadow of the mountains here, so we get much better weather than we get in Llanberis or Capel. And we can go to the coast where the weather's, it's one of those places where it doesn't rain a lot, because of the rain shadow. It's amazing. Change is difficult when you live here. What I would say is I lived here in the 80s, and when I lived here in the 80s, the Welsh language was much less prevalent than it is now. There's definitely been a shift in that it's taught in all schools in Wales. People have become much more open about using it. So back in the 80s, if you tried to say something in Welsh, people would just laugh and take the mick. And converse to that horrible old story about people switching to Welsh, people would switch to English as soon as you went in a room. So they would be speaking Welsh and they would actually switch to English. It's actually the other way around, is that great myth. Whereas now people are much more proud of speaking Welsh. They appreciate us trying Welsh, and they're very supportive and encouraging of us trying to, at least in our case, pronounce the names of the mountains correctly. It's a challenge to learn to speak Welsh. Obviously, our kids speak Welsh because they've learned in school. But for us as adults, it is difficult, but we can work on pronunciation of the names of the mountains. And one of the things I did in Nature Snowdonia was just put in the back a little appendix of how English people might be able to tackle some of the Welsh words. And if you've looked through the book, you'll notice instead of saying Snowdon, I say Snowdon once at the beginning, and after that we say Chwyddfa. So we can try. For me, I'm from Yorkshire. We don't have R's or H's in Yorkshire. But we do here.
Well, you're doing pretty well there, I have to say. I don't think I could repeat that. So yeah, because again, has there been a problem with? It was a problem, wasn't it, through the 80s and 90s, where the communities in Scotland and Wales were kind of emptying of all the young people, and then you had the opposite problem of all the sort of the wealthy people coming in and buying up all the properties as holiday lets. That's still a problem, I take it. Is it easing off? Is it less of a problem? Are the communities revitalizing a little bit, or?
I think it's got worse this year, actually, because people have wanted to move out to rural areas. Cornwall's now beyond the pocket of most people, as is the Lake District. We call it Keswick on Thames now. It's crazy up there. Here, there's been a fantastic initiative, and it's a group called the Outdoor Partnership. And you know, Plas is a good example. Most of the staff, most of the senior staff are from England, and being English, we had opportunities in the outdoors that a lot of the local people didn't have. So, you know, I went to an outdoor centre in the Dales, and then we went to the lakes, and we went to, you know, we came to Snowdonia, and eventually, you know, we got qualified and got jobs and became outdoor instructors. Much harder route for people living in Bangor or Carnarvon. You know, it's mad, isn't it? Llandudno, you know, don't know Snowdonia is there. So the outdoor partnership was set up with the express aim of increasing the number or increasing the accessibility to the outdoors for local people. And they did it initially through clubs, and then they train up volunteers to be leaders to run the clubs. And some of those go on to be professionals. So the outdoor partnership has shifted that balance and made the outdoors much more accessible to local people in North Wales, and it's so successful. This is the best bit. They've now set up an outdoor partnership in Cumbria, actually, around Whitehaven, Workington and Barrow. They've set up one in Northern Ireland and one in Ayr in Scotland. So it's a really, really successful model. The off-quoted stat is that when it started in 2005, there was something like 3 or 4% of outdoor instructors who spoke Welsh, and now the number's up to 25 plus percent qualified instructors working in the medium of Welsh. So it's a real good success story, and it's one that's spreading from Snowdonia to other areas, which I think is fantastic.
That's really good. And of course, a lot of those younger people now going into jobs as outdoor instructors and staying in the communities and living in the communities they grew up in, really, which is a really good thing.
Definitely, brilliant.
Yeah. So you do say we've talked about the Mountain Leader things. Just for those who aren't aware of what the Mountain Leader Award is, just give us a brief rundown of that.
Yeah, so the Mountain Leader Award started in the early 60s, 1964, and the idea was that anybody can go hill walking. There's absolutely no rules or regulations in the UK, and that's fantastic. Even no rules or regulations in needing a qualified leader. But if you want to take responsibility for other people in the hills, then it seems reasonable to put yourself forward for some sort of assessment. An assessment that includes a good ability to navigate, a good ability to know what to do in a problem situation, and a knowledge and understanding of the place that you're going into. So you understand some of the issues that we've been talking about. So the Mountain Leader qualification was set up in the early 60s. People have to be hill walkers to access the scheme. They then do a training course, a consolidation period, and an assessment, and then they have to do CPD subsequently, which is when they come to see me, all being well. There's also a hill and moorland qualification, so you can do one that avoids the steeper bits. So if you are a bit worried about Cribgoch or the Cullen and Skye, you know, these places, you can still be a leader, do a hill and moorland qualification. That also doesn't have the overnight camping. The Mountain Leader has wild camping in the mountains, which is quite a big deal for some people. And they've also introduced a lowland leader qualification as well, so that you can start your journey to being a leader, looking after other people in the countryside, wherever you live in the UK. So there's 3 qualifications there: lowland leader, hill and moorland leader, mountain leader. Mountain leader is the most famous one, which has been around a long time, but generally a good thing to do, really. There's nothing wrong with it at all.
Yeah, I was going to say, even if you're not particularly interested in leading groups or working in the outdoors, I think the Mountain Leader qualification is just fun to do, and it's incredibly rewarding, and you learn a huge amount. And it is that wider picture, isn't it? It's not just about how do you go walking, it is about the geology and the geography and the history, and it's quite good. And of course, going the other way, there's a winter Mountain Leader which steps up the other way, doesn't it, into a little bit more hardcore.
Yeah, particularly in Scotland, things can get a bit more serious with shortened daylight hours, snow, you need ice axe, crampons, all the rest of it. But yeah, that's down the line a little bit, is that winter mountain leader. You can get away with it most of the time in Wales or Scotland, Wales or England, because it's very rare that we have snow down to sea level. So both the Lake District and Snowdonia are coastal destinations, so they'll tend typically to be a snow line somewhere. So you can all pretty much always, I live in Snowdonia here, and we never see any snow in this village because we're at sea level,
Yeah, Yeah, I think the winter mountain leader tends to be people who are more thinking of a career, because it's that extra level of commitment and difficulty, isn't it? Really needing to find that. Oh, excuse me. So what drew you to the outdoors that you ended up where you are? Because you were an assessor with Plas Brenin, were you, as well, for the mountain leader course, weren't you?
Yeah, I was actually in charge of what we call home nation schemes, which is everything, all those ones I've mentioned, including the mountain leader, and then there's some rock climbing ones as well, rock climbing qualifications. So a large part of your work when you work at the National Centre is training assessment. There's loads of other people do some of those qualifications now. It's just the higher level ones that are retained at the National Centre. So the mountaineering instructor qualifications, they will be qualifications that you're teaching people who can lead multi-pitch climbs, teach people multi-pitch climb, teach people in summer, teach people in winter, but also would be trainers and assessors for the other qualifications. So those are the things that only happen really at Glenmore Lodge, Plas Brenin, and to some degree Tollymore over in Ireland. But that's quite a niche thing, if you like. That's quite small. Centres like Glenmore Lodge and Plas Brenin do the whole range. You can go on an introduction to navigation course if you want, as you can with loads of independent providers around the place. There's no shortage of those things going on. Lovely courses with lovely people. But I started in scouting, and I think a lot of people still do. So I always have a soft spot for scouting. And that was taking us out onto the moors in Yorkshire, and where we lived, that was pretty easy to do. And there was obviously more than just me. There was a few people. So soon got using buses and getting a bus up to the moors and getting another bus back from a different part of the moors and all this kind of thing. And we sort of stumbled into rock climbing as well, and rock climbing sort of dominated probably most of my life, really.
Yeah, I was talking to Paul Besley about this a few weeks back, and it is that thing where there seems to be an issue where people used to learn the skill of being in the hills through being in organizations like the Scouts or the Army Cadets, but now the hills are almost too accessible for some people, and that's why we see a lot of people getting themselves into problems, because they have no guidance, leadership, mentorship, and they'll literally just chuck some sandwiches in a carrier bag and head up into the hills because they're so accessible by car, aren't they? Huge problems in Snowdonia, Penny Pass, with parking, of course. Everyone just heading for the hills.
And I think that's probably why you started Mount Walking Newbies, isn't it? Because people of my generation have learned this stuff over the years from different groups of people, be it scouting or school or whatever. So when somebody says, I don't know, what sort of boots should I buy? Well, I was going to go to the shop and buy some boots, and the people asking the question are coming from a different background, aren't they? So I think it's been really interesting to watch that. And I do watch the questions that come up on Mountain Walking Newbies, and I resist sarcastic comments because you have to appreciate people are coming from a different place, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, it's more stark in rock climbing in a way, because people are starting rock climbing indoors. So they start in a climbing wall indoors in an urban conurbation, whereas we started on gritstone edges in West Yorkshire. So it's quite a different journey. In fact, we were hill walkers before we were climbers. Yeah. So we knew something about the upland environment and which gamekeepers to run away from and that sort of thing. But nowadays it's just a different way in, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was the whole reason behind Mountain Walking Newbies, was this idea that people do want to ask questions, which some might consider to be stupid questions. Some people hold that view, but it's like, if they don't ask those questions, then they're not going to find out. And that really was so yes, restrain from being sarcastic, Mike. I'd hate to have to kick you out of the group. That would be most embarrassing.
No, it's better people ask the questions and feel enabled to ask the question. And my contemporaries who have to learn, that's the case. And I'm going to do a shameless plug now, because I'm writing a new book, Mike, and it's called The Mountain Leader. And it's a handbook for mountain leaders. And this is one of the issues in there, is saying, as a mountain leader, you are going to be taking people out who don't know anything about going hill walking, and their first experience will be with you. And yes, of course, you want them to have a posh pair of boots and a Gore-Tex jacket, but actually, they don't need the most expensive boots and a Gore-Tex jacket the first time they go hill walking.
Yeah.
They want something that's windproof rather than waterproof. They want some shoes that are comfortable. And if they turn up in trainers, then you plan your walk so it can be done in trainers, and then have a conversation about footwear. So that's a little theme that's in this book I'm writing at the moment, which will be due out in the autumn.
All
but
right.
it's for mountain leaders, not newbies.
You'd be surprised some people might buy it. I'll get the details from you, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. So I mean, because the other thing about the Mountain Leader Award, I guess it allows you to think about things like insurance, doesn't it? So it's all very well and good taking people up on the hills, and generally you'd be walking with your friends, but should you take strangers, and it might even happen with friends, and somebody gets injured and then they decide to sue you because you were the leader, that's where things can become sticky. So I guess having something like the Mountain Leader Award proves your qualification and allows you to get insurance and cover yourself, doesn't it?
It does. And mountain training have set up something called the Mountain Training Association, which makes insurance really easy, because as soon as you get your mountain leader qualification, then you can get your insurance through the Mountain Training Association. It's worth saying that people tend not to get sued, though. And actually, the most experienced person in the group will have a duty of care. So if you're somebody who's been walking 6 times and you're showing your friends how to go on, then you have a duty of care to that group. So technically, if you haven't taken all reasonable precautions, something goes wrong, you could be found negligent. But it's not happened yet.
Yeah.
Been one or two, had a little try. There was a very interesting case in Ireland, which is obviously a different country, but they tried to sue the Irish government, really, who built a boardwalk. Somebody tripped on a boardwalk and tried to sue the government. And they actually won the first case, but it got kicked out on appeal. So there is also this thing called voluntaire non-fit injurer, whereby you take responsibility for your own actions. Particularly as an adult, you do have, it's never one person or the other to blame, it's a percentage of blame. So, we're all responsible for ourselves, basically, is what it says. And there isn't a court in the land would really want to go to town on somebody on duty care in the hills. But of course, the other thing to bear in mind is it's incredibly safe. Absolutely. I mean, I was researching with this book because it's so safe. This is why I want mountain leaders to know more about the environment, to be better at the environment, because actually, I teach first aid as well. And most of the people who come on a first aid course do a refresher every 3 years, do a very special outdoor first aid. It's really, really cool first aid course. I know first aid course can be quite boring, but this one's really good because you get to move people and you get to feed people. The thinking being, if you're in a remote place and something goes wrong, your duty switches to keeping people alive rather than worrying about minor injuries like broken legs and things. And unless you move somebody out of the wind, give them something to eat, then they deteriorate. So they're really cool first aid courses, or outdoor first aid courses. But the fact is, most people who come back for their renewal have done no first aid in the last 3 years. And actually, we don't do much first aid in the hills. And I looked at some stats for the book, and in 2018, the BMC, through a Sport England survey, reckoned there was something like 2.8 million people who were doing some degree of regularity hill walking. In 2017, there were 2,000 mountain rescues, of which over half were non-serious. It was maybe a quarter of them actually had an injury where somebody needed carrying off or helicoptering off. And even then, it's broken ankles, it's turned ankles, it's or I'm a bit dizzy because I've slipped and banged my head. So hill walking, and people must understand that, is incredibly safe. The difficulty is, if it does go wrong, it can be a bit spectacular, and it gets on the news.
Yeah.
And, road traffic accidents are so passe that even though they're spectacular and people die every day, they don't get on the news. So it is perceived to be more dangerous than it is hill walking. It's incredibly safe, really. As long as you slip in the right places and not the wrong place.
As you say, it is that thing that when it does go wrong, it can go badly wrong. If you're 3 hours away from the road, there's no ambulance going to turn up in 10 minutes and pick you up. You could be out on the hill for hours waiting for help. And I guess the thing to say is, even if, as you talk about the duty of care, even if you do have insurance, if you haven't done what you should have done as a mountain leader, that insurance is going to be null and void anyway, isn't it? They're just simply not going to cover you. You know, you're going to be on your own, I'm afraid. So, any particularly good stories? Because you help trainee mountain leaders as well, gen upon their skills for the qualification, don't you? Any good stories to tell?
In terms of safety and accidents?
Anything really.
Not really.
Anything interesting or entertaining without naming names?
Oh no, you put me on the spot there. Navigationally embarrassed are the sort of funniest ones. There was a gentleman who made some navigational errors and had a bit of time to sort himself out and decided where we were, which wasn't where we were, because as he was telling me where we were, it was quite misty, but we could hear the train behind us, and the Snowdon Mountain Railway was about 100 meters away. So if we're where you say we are, what's that? As the train came steaming past. So I think that was a slam dunk. He wasn't up to standard, unfortunately.
Bit more training required. So is the writing, I mean, you've got one published book to your name, haven't you? You wrote quite a few years ago now, the first print of that, wasn't it? When was that?
Yeah, the first copy of Nature Snowdonia was done back in 2010, and it was kind of an evolution of an idea. There was never meant to be a book there, but it was just pulling together these tales, because what we were very frightened of was having 10 mountain leader plants, and nobody wanted to limit mountain leader knowledge to that. But then it all becomes a bit overwhelming, because it's about more than flowers as well, you know, geology and glaciation and lichens and mosses and birds, you know, and mammals. So there's all sorts up there. So it just seemed better just to stick as much. Well, the idea of the book is go for a walk for about 2 years and take a picture of everything you see, and that's what's in the book. So even when we put the first book out, we were debating whether to put Snowdon Lily in, because you don't see the Snowdon Lily. I have to take you to a special place to see it. It's not something you come across. So we thought, do we put it in? Do we not put it in? In the end, we did put that in because it's such an iconic species. But the bedrock of the book is stuff you will see when you were hill walking, which is why it's seasonal. So this is what you might notice more in winter, spring, summer and autumn, and a little bit about it. And what we tried to do was to tell people a little story about each thing. So rather than all that botanical or ornithological detail that we don't even understand or care about, is a little story about this plant eats insects, or this plant's good for toothache or something like that, you know. And it just adds that little something to being out in the hills, I think. And you know, the book's designed to be used, carried in a rucksack. It's quite small, and it's completely, if it gets wet, you can just buy another copy. It's fantastic.
Yeah, you would say that, wouldn't you?
Yeah. The first edition wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, so it was brilliant to get the opportunity that when it sold out to update it and make it better.
Yeah.
So I think the second edition I'm much more proud of. It's great.
Yeah, that's a good thing, because there are books out there that somebody's written and then they never revisit them, and you find that the information starts to become outdated, or just it just doesn't seem relevant anymore. And it's nice that books are updated and evolved, really.
It is. I mean, 10 years ago, we weren't really talking about rewilding or nature-friendly farming in the mainstream. You know, people obviously were, but it wasn't something you'd expect a mountain leader to know something about. Whereas now we do expect a mountain leader to be able to comment on the way the hills look and why they look that and what challenges they face in the future. But yeah, you need to be constantly updating, which is, we've got other avenues for doing that, like these podcasts and
yeah. Facebook. I mean, it's funny how you say, you know, you almost stumbled into writing, and that seems to be a common thread. I've interviewed Adrian Trendle and Paul Besley, and they both kind of stumbled into producing guidebooks, and now they are published authors. Paul Besley's becoming, I mean, he's writing novels now. I don't think Adrian has the same plans. Is the writing becoming a bigger part of things for you? Is it something you particularly enjoy?
I don't think enjoy is the right phrase, but in common with Paul and Adrian, when you've been around a while, you've got something to say. And although the internet is amazing for saying things, there's people still like a book, I think. So to collect some of that stuff together in a book is hopefully helpful. I mean, the Mountain Leader book evolves. It's quite a what we've seen with the Mountain Leader qualification is there's a big focus on navigation and road work on the training, sort of the technical skills, because they're new to people. So necessarily you need to do quite a bit of that on a training course, and you stand there and say, but it's also about the environment, but it's also about leadership. But those things get lost a little bit on that training course, so that people go away from the training course needing to get better at navigating or consolidate the navigation or practice the road work. So they feel that's what the qualification is about. Yet when you become a mountain leader, you don't really do much navigation because you kind of know where you're going, and you don't do any road work unless it's extremely exceptional circumstances. But what you do is you lead all the time, and you're trying to learn about the place you're in and tell people about the place you're in. So the idea of this book was to give some context to the qualification and hopefully help trainers and assessors as well as people who have got their qualification. So it's an aid memoir for those who've got it. It's a picture of the journey for those who haven't got it. And it's just hopefully going to be a helpful handbook for people to refer to say, look, we're doing this bit now, which focuses on navigation, but the bigger scheme of things, you need to be thinking about leadership and environment and these other areas of the qualification. So that's kind of where it's come from, just trying to udge up thinking about leadership and looking after people in the hills, udge up some of these stories about the environment, and just sort of downplay some of the navigation to the degree that when you pass your qualification, you don't need to navigate quite as insanely with ring contours and things. You can actually just look at your phone and it tells you where you are nowadays, you know. So it's accepting that and embracing that and using this new technology, because your focus should be on the people you're leading, not really detail of the map.
Yeah,
sounds a bit controversial, doesn't it? But in the grand scheme of things, when we're leading a group, we're not doing much navigating. We're looking after people.
Yeah, I mean, generally, you're taking, if people need someone to take them on the hill, generally they want to be sticking to the easy paths anyway, don't they? So it's pragmatic.
Absolutely.
It's common sense. And I think as well, as you say, there's lots of information on the internet, but I think one of the problems with the internet is anybody, irrespective of their knowledge or lack of knowledge, can put stuff on the internet. Whereas a book, if somebody's gone to the trouble of writing a book and it's been peer reviewed, for want of a better word, and checked by authors, you know that it's an authoritative piece of work and you can rely on what's in there. And it's the danger of relying on the internet, isn't it? You can get all sorts of nonsense on there.
I have a complete love-hate relationship with my editor. He's also an expert, you know, he's a mountaineer and instructor, and he's really good at making books as well, Franco. But every time I get an email, I open it with trepidation. You know. Tell him I absolutely hate you, Franco, but I completely respect and totally appreciate the feedback he gives, because very often you give people things to read and they'll come up with the odd thing, but you know, basically they're, yeah, it's nice, we like that, it's good, and that really helps with the tone, helps you to understand you're talking to the right people. But actually turning it into a book, you need somebody like Franco, who's the editor, who says you can't write that, or you need to phrase it this way. And I want, as with Nature Snowdonia, an informal book where we're having a chat. I don't want it to be too standoffish and formal. So it's just trying to strike that balance so that it's readable, that you're drawn in, with being an authoritative piece of literature, you know. It's quite interesting.
So what's your next book after that then?
Well, I can assure you, and I can't imagine there's any author who doesn't say that's the last one, I'm never doing this again. But this lockdown has just been wasted writing a book. And, I should have been out every day.
Brilliant. Well, it's been really good. Just to sort of end on that, you tapping into your experience as a sort of a mountain leader assessor. Top tips, any sort of top tips for people who are mountain walking newbies heading into the hills, what they should or shouldn't do, and particularly maybe with an environmental bias?
Yeah, I mean, a mountain leader has to be able to walk and talk. So you will go through a period of getting focused on navigation, but it's not the be all end all, because you have to be able to talk to people. And I can tell the tale of two people on assessment, one who passed and one who was deferred on navigation. And they were both a bit weak on the detail of micro navigation. But whereas one had barely sufficient experience to be there, the other one had done the whole Munros. So you have a confidence in somebody who's done the Munros that they're going to make some good decisions in the hills, whereas somebody who's just reached the threshold, they've absolutely got to nail things. So there is no substitute for going walking in the hills. And people get hung up about what are the mountain training defined quality mountain days, and people get really hung up on these. You know, it's not a complicated definition. It's about going hill walking, ideally to the top of hills, ideally in places you haven't been. And you will understand that the words hill and mountain interchange constantly in Britain, and you mustn't get hung up about that either. We call walking up Ben Nevis hill walking, even though it's a mountain, you know. So you'll understand those things. When you understand those things, you're probably ready to think about being a mountain leader. It's a whole nother language, isn't it?
Yeah. And in terms of just people who aren't looking for the mountain leader role, but just heading into the hills and thinking, you know what, I'm going to jump in my car and go to Snowdon tomorrow and go up Snowdon. Is there any what hints or tips for mountain walking newbies that you would pass on from your knowledge of Snowdon, particularly for someone who's never been there, say?
Can I tell it in the form of a story? A few years ago, I was going up Snowdon with an ITV journalist. It was the Wales Year of Adventure. And I was really keen on the film to show what I had in my bag, not because things go wrong, because things never go wrong. But if they do go wrong, you're halfway up a mountain, so you need an extra coat to put on, a pair of gloves, a hat, something to keep you warm. We use these things called blizzard bags, something to eat, something to drink, because you're going to have a long wait while somebody comes to help you. So I was just showing what was in my bag, and we carried on with the journey. And came across a friend of mine who had just come across a member of the public who tripped and put his hand out and broken his forearm. It's quite a nasty break to his forearm. So I said, oh, you know, Mike, can you give us a hand? So I went over, we did some first aid, we sorted him out and all the rest of it. And the film crew backed off while we made sure this gentleman was okay and we could evacuate him. In fact, the Clanberish Mountain Rescue Team came and got him from a little bit further down the mountain. And of course, I went back to the camera crew, and you can imagine the journalist was beside herself, wasn't she? You know, because we just had a real incident on the hill, and so we had to talk through it for camera. And that was the end of that. We went up Snowdon, we came back down Snowdon, and I remember my mate ringing me up just after it being on TV and saying, "That was bloody good." So what do you mean that was good? He said, the way you set the accident up for the film thing. I said, no, we didn't set it up. It was genuine. It really am. Oh, he said, I don't believe it came across so well. So they don't happen very often, but by gum, if they do happen, you need an extra coat in your bag, if nothing else.
Yeah, perfect. Brilliant. Well, Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting. Thank you very much for giving us the time. I'll put links to your books or your book in the show notes. I'll put link to your podcast, which is Notes from the Hill, into the show notes as well. Thanks very much. I think you've got a busy day ahead of you. Is it nice and sunny where you are?
It is. It's always sunny.
Always sunny. Brilliant. Mike, thanks very much for giving us your time. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you, Michael. See you around. Cheers.
Speak soon.
Bye.
Bye now.